On this episode of Take Back the Advantage, we're going to learn an ancient Chinese secret we can use for deception today, and we're going to talk with Wade Lance, the CTO of Illusive Networks. All this coming up in just under 10 seconds. Deception has been around for a very long time. Around 500 BC, Sun Tzu wrote in The Art of War, "If you know your enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle." Now, that quote is interesting, but the question is, what does it have to do with deception or cyber deception? So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story, and I'm going to apologize in advance if I mispronounce these names, but this all happened around 341 AD in China. So you had two players, Pang Juan and Sun, I think it's Bin, Sun Bin, something like that, B-I-N, I'm not sure the pronunciation. So these two guys were rivals. They were studying military strategy from their famous teacher, and there was a bit of a rivalry going on there. And it turns out that Sun Bin was a little bit favored. He kind of got a little bit better of an education. So Pang Juan was jealous. And it turned out that Pang Juan ended up falsely accusing Sun Bin of treason to the king at the time. And there was a lot of weird interplay there. But it turned out that it resulted in this guy, Sun Bin, getting his face tattooed, and he had his kneecaps removed, which is, generally speaking, suboptimal, I would assume. So he's now effectively a cripple. So these two guys they've got armies, they end up fighting, and warfare erupted. So the deal was that Pang Juan was, he was cocky, he was arrogant. He viewed his side to be, the way that I heard it described was hard as nails, right? They were the rock solid tippy point of the spear kind of a thing. And they also said that Sun Bin's, his army were a bunch of cowards. They were weak and they were cowardly. And so what Sun Bin did is he took that knowledge. He knew that Pang Juan thought that his side was more formidable, braver, more aggressive, more ready for combat, whereas Sun Bin was going to be weaker and they were going to be more cowardly. So what Sun Bin did was he said, all right, let's use that. So what he did was he had his army establish, they were set up, and he knew that Pang Juan's scouts were reconning the army. So over the course of a number of days, what he did was he had the army light fewer and fewer and fewer fires at night. And what that did was it caused the preconceptions on the part of Pang Juan's army to come into play. Well, these guys are cowards. If there are less and less and less fires every night, then that means part of his army must be deserting. So now his army is weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. And because they believe themselves to be hard as nails and the point of the spear, that facilitated a very aggressive response. So Sun Bin appeared weak, exploiting his knowledge of Pang Juan's, his tactics, but also his belief system. And what ended up happening was there was an attack. Pang Juan tried to attack Sun Bin, and as the legend goes, they got to an area and there was writing carved into a tree, and the writing supposedly said, "Pang Juan dies under this tree." And when he read that, that's when the ambush happened. And I've heard two different stories. Either Pang Juan killed himself underneath the tree, or he was killed by Sun Bin. Now, the reason why this is super important, we're talking deception. And Sun Bin understood his adversary's expectations. And based on those expectations, he gave the enemy exactly what they were looking for. He took advantage of their overconfidence and then, I guess, won that battle. And all of this applies to the world of cyber deception. When we're doing cyber deception, we need to understand our adversary and we need to understand ourselves. And if we can do that effectively, then we can come out on top more often than not, as Sun Tzu just said. My name is Kevin Fiskus, and this is Take Back the Advantage. Now, before I go any further, I want to introduce my guest this week. So my guest, Wade Lance, is the field CTO and solutions architect for cyber deception and response for Illusive Networks. Now, Lance has got a really interesting bio, and he's probably one of the few people that can say he's been involved in deception solutions for over a decade or around a decade. And that's a long time when it comes to talking about cyber deception and those types of things. Has previously worked for organizations like Cyberproof, Calvio, Counterattack, Washington Health Foundation, Fox Industries. He was the founder and general manager of Linkware, worked for Microsoft, and what I thought was really, really cool, a professional mountain guide who developed a new method for technical rock and ice climbing instruction that's still used today, which I think that's cool, mostly because I know absolutely nothing about that except gravity is bad. So, Wade, welcome to Take Back the Advantage. Anything you want to add, whether it's cyber deception or ice climbing?
Thanks, Kevin. I sure appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. And on the ice climbing front, all I can say is, I still have all my fingers and toes, which is pretty good work for as long as I've been running the mountains. So pretty happy about that. The deception space has been a wild segment to be in. And to watch it change and grow over the last 10 years has really been something. So I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Now, I do have to say, this was funny, because when you said, I have all my fingers and toes, you've got the really cool bricked out background. But because of the way that, it does the backgrounds, when you said, I have all my fingers and toes, they didn't all show up in the video, which is awesome. That couldn't have gone better. I loved it. So anyway, what I wanted to do is, and again, thank you again for joining. Really appreciate it. What I always like to do at the beginning of these is spend a little bit of time talking about a couple of relevant news stories. So I just sort of picked a couple that seemed relevant. And given the fact that you work for Illusive, the first one I have is particularly relevant, where the title of the article was Israel's Asuda Medical Center implements Illusive Networks to protect critical data. Now, I brought this up not as much as an ad for Illusive Networks, right? I mean, they can talk about their stuff. Wade can talk about their stuff better than I can. But I brought it up because one of the big challenges that organizations have when thinking about deception is this kind of groupthink crowd mentality where it's like, well, wait a minute, why should I go deploy deception when nobody else is doing it? Well, the problem with deception is there's a perception by a lot of people, a lot of organizations, that they don't want to let people know that they're being deceptive because that could tip off the bad guys and all that. And I guess there's some truth to that. We can debate that a little bit, but I thought there were some interesting quotes in the article. So I may be pronouncing these very badly, but Tamir Ronan, Chief Information Security Officer at Asuda, said, "We needed a solution that would offer superior deception technology while also giving us a way to better manage our attack surface. Illusive Network Solutions meets both of these criteria, giving us greater confidence in our ability to keep critical patient data safe." Bob Horn, who's the Chief Revenue Officer for Illusive, said the healthcare industry is particularly vulnerable to cyber attack due to its complex nature and the variable digital assets it stewards. Our cybersecurity solutions help healthcare organizations around the world stop attackers from reaching their targets by destroying their decision-making ability. Our work with Asuda furthers our traction in healthcare space, and we look forward to helping more organizations like Asuda secure their critical systems and data. Now, I want to just focus on that last statement for a second, and the concept of destroying their decision-making ability, which I think is a really profound statement. Wade, how would you expand upon that? Like, for those who don't know a lot about cyber deception, what do you mean or I guess, speaking for Bob, what does he mean by destroying their decision-making ability?
Yeah, great point, Kevin. So we think about cyber attackers, right? And once an attacker gets a beachhead in the environment, I sucker somebody through some kind of a social engineering phishing campaign. Now I've got a beachhead. Now I begin the process as a bad guy of understanding the environment. Where are the critical systems? What credentials are available? Where can I get at? Where can I go? What's available? That's the decision-making process, right? As a bad guy, I'm always trying to balance the desire to get at the goodies with the need to not be detected, right? So I'm playing that game. And really, if an organization doesn't have a robust deception capability, all of the data that I gather in that environment as an attacker, it's all real and it's all reusable. So every time I'm in your environment, I'm learning, and every time I come back, I can leverage the data that I learned in a prior engagement. You might detect me and clean my beachhead, but when I come back a month later, all of my prior reconnaissance is still completely useful. And so this is the idea about manipulating the attacker's reality, is to begin to tell a story. And that's what great deception is. It's storytelling. So that when an attacker lands in the environment, they're getting a story that a large amount of that story is simply not true. And it makes it extremely difficult for an attacker to understand the environment, to understand how to move, to understand where the goodies are and where the goodies aren't. So that's really the key differentiator that customers get with deception, is this ability to manipulate the attacker's reality in a way that destroys their decision making, because every time they're in the environment, they're not learning, they're being misinformed.
Yeah, awesome. And I when you say that, there's a couple things that come to mind. One of those is the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. And so the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, if folks aren't aware of it, was an effort to try to model an attack. And the concept of a kill chain comes out of the military. And the concept is, if somebody's going to attack me, but I can disrupt that attack in known areas, I can stop the attack. Well, the cyber kill chain has actually had some criticisms, because the first two, I guess, phases of the cyber kill chain are reconnaissance and weaponization. Now, let's face it, reconnaissance happens outside of my control as a defender, and the weaponization happens, again, it's being done by the attackers entirely. So a lot of people were like, this cyber kill chain thing isn't that useful because 2 of the 5 components of it, I think it's 5 or 6, we can't interrupt. Well, we couldn't interrupt. But now when we get into deception, we actually can interrupt this concept of reconnaissance and weaponization. We can lie to the attackers as they're learning about us, and then that would cause them to come up with the wrong attacks, to attack the wrong systems and all that kind of stuff. So that's huge. And the other one that I wanted to throw out there, and you kind of talked to this, but I want to put a really fine point on it. If I'm a defender and I catch an attacker, great. I kick the attacker off my network. They change IP addresses, they change tactics, and they're back, right? So they can change what they're doing constantly. We have in large part been static. Our environments are what they are. And what deception allows us to do is effectively do the same things that the attackers are doing to us. Be dynamic, change what we look like in almost real time, which I think is super, super, super powerful.
Yeah, and you raise a really good point, though. You raise an excellent point, Kevin, and that's that in order for deception to be effective, you have to do good storytelling, and you have to keep the story fresh, right? So if I take my deceptive information out of a bucket and sprinkle it around every place, and it sits there for 6 months, it's not going to be believable, right? It's not going to have the effect. The attackers are very quickly going to determine what of this is real versus what of this is deceptive, and they're off on their way. So this has always been one of the difficulties in being effective at deception, is how do we tell a story in the environment that is realistic and compelling, but constantly adapting to the changes in the environment And that's one of the exciting things that has shifted really in the last several years is our ability to do that.
Oh yeah. And that is very different from just about anything else we do in IT or security, right? In IT and security, we live in a world of binary data, ones and zeros, on, off. It's not very creative in most cases. Yeah, we have to beat the technology into submission, but there's not a lot of creativity, where with deception, it's very, the technology is usually not the challenge at all. The technology is, I mean, let's face it, we've been doing honeypots for 20, 30 years. We've been doing deception for 2,000 years, 3,000 years. So it's not that anything is new. It's just we get to tell a story. And part of the thing that I think is really, really powerful when it comes to deception is the fact that if you think about traditional detection technologies, IDS, SIM, stuff like that, those technologies, we end up spending an enormous number of man hours and resources just trying to tweak and tune and filter and adjust millions of alerts every day. And think of the man hours that are doing that. Well, imagine that we can shift those man hours over to now actively interacting with the attacker. We don't need to babysit what are, in some respects, faulty tools. I don't mean that they're bad. I mean, SIMs and IDSs and things like that have very specific limitations. And as long as you understand what they are, they can be done really, really well. But do we really want to, do I want to have 3 full-time people who do nothing but tune my IDS? Or would I rather have 3 full-time people who are actively creating deception cover stories, manipulating things to feed attackers exactly what we want, which is huge.
Yeah, and really what's exciting today is that you probably don't need 3 full-time people on the deception side. The automation can run a lot of that.
Oh yeah.
I think something that is worth pointing out is that, you know, on the Illusive side, one of the things that so attracted me to that organization was this understanding of attacker mentality. A lot of companies in the deception space, honestly, are built and managed by people with a lot of experience in security. They're defenders by nature. That's what they've done. And really, to be good at deception, you need to have an attacker mentality. You need to understand very specifically how attackers operate and how to leverage that propensity that attackers have against them. And so at Illusive, one of the things, and Asuda pointed this out, is that they selected Illusive because of our kind of a holistic approach to eliminating malicious lateral movement. At Illusive, we don't really consider ourselves a deception company as much as an anti-lateral movement company, right? And so one part of the process is very much reducing the attack surface. How do we identify legitimate objects in the environment, privileged credentials and sensitive connection strings that attackers and insiders can leverage and automatically clean them? Mm-hmm. Then use the data about that kind of information in the environment to backplant a very customized story automatically in the environment that gives the appearance of, in fact, those exact same kinds of things, but those objects are, in fact, deceptive. And this removal of the low-hanging fruit and replacement with automated, targeted data that we know is appealing to attackers because we know how they operate really shifts the balance of power. And I like something you said, and that's that what we're doing, I think the workload in the SOC has been just out of control for years. And now with the whole work from home shift and COVID and all that, it's just exploded. And so really attackers have been using automated processes to create manual work for us as security teams. And what we're doing on the deception side is using automated infrastructure to create manual processes for attackers. And this just totally shifts the balance of power, and in many cases makes it to where it's just no longer worth the effort. This is why organizations like Asuda are now coming out and saying, hey, we're using Illusive because honestly, the method is such that doesn't really help you to know that Illusive is here. It's not going to solve your problem. You're still going to land here, and if you get a beachhead and start looking through and trying to make decisions, and okay, so you know deception is present, that does not help you figure out which of this data is deceptive and which of it is real.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the points that you made there, when you start talking about understanding the attacker, I mean, it goes back to that quote from Sun Tzu about know your enemy and know yourself. But the other thing is, one of the pushbacks that I get when I talk to people about deception is, this is just honeypots, right? It's honeypots. And the fact of the matter is, yeah, there is some similarities in terms of the underlying technology. But to me, one of the big differences between what we do now with cyber deception and honeypots is honeypots were largely, I always say it's like creating a hacker's zoo, right? Or the way I described it in last week's podcast was a roach motel for attackers, right? We hope they go in there, but and if they do, we're going to go watch them and you know, see what they do or whatever. But with what we're doing with deception today is we're saying we as defenders understand what the attackers are going to do. And because of that, we can plant our traps, if you want to call it, where we know the attackers are going to go. I always equate it to the conflict in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong would put these punji stakes, right? These sharpened bamboo stakes. But they wouldn't plant them randomly in the Vietnamese jungle. They would plant them in trails because that's where their adversary was going to be. Well, effectively, we're putting our traps where we know the attackers are going to go because we have a knowledge of their behavior. And that is a really important difference between sort of the generic honeypot and what we're doing today. And I think the other piece that you said, when you talk about making manual processes for attackers, and I say this all the time, but I think it's really important, is that we always say defenders need to be right 100% of the time, attackers need to be right once. And we can argue about the factuality, if you will, the correctness of that statement, but it is not arguable to say that a mistake on the part of an attacker costs them very little. A mistake on the part of defenders costs us a lot. But with deception, we don't need the attackers to interact with all of our deceptive elements. In fact, they could avoid all of our deceptive elements except one. They touch the one and we have them. So once the attacker executes an attack and gets on our network, then we now change the script. Now, quite literally, the attacker needs to be right 100% of the time, and we as defenders need to be right once. And that is game changing. I would say that is industry changing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Kevin. You know, one of the things that I experience doing this is kind of Groundhog Day all over again, talking to people about deception. Because when you say to somebody, hey, we leverage deception as a method, they say honeypots, and that's what they think, you know. And really the giant shift has been that deception has moved off of the honeypot and onto the production hosts, right? The storytelling now is all done right on the production systems. And it's done in such a way as the normal user will not see the objects that are placed on the system, but we know how attackers operate. And so the deceptive data, the deceptive credentials, and the history of interactions with remote hosts and the little goodies scattered intelligently across the system, the normal user will never find them, but they're placed right where attackers know how to go. And so this methodology, this shift of deception off of the honeypot and onto the production system is really the dramatic game changer. Now, when an attacker gets a beachhead in the environment, I don't have to worry about trying to lure them into a honeypot, get them to interact with it, and then get them to believe that it's real, not easy to do, and then get them to do something interesting on that system that I can actually learn from. That's actually a very tall order.
Yeah.
Today, the deception happens on the production system. So wherever you land, you're immediately confronted with a manipulated environment. And it's a real game changer because I know you're going to run into the deception as an attacker. I know that you're going to get suckered into using one of these objects. And when you do, at Illusive, we're going to pull forensics information directly from that source system. I'm not trying to sucker you into something else. You're already doing something interesting. Let's just learn from it right now.
Yep.
It's a complete shift. And as you said, the attacker now has I like to say that without deception, we face a big data problem as security people. How do we differentiate between normal movement between systems and hidden malicious lateral movement? How do we differentiate? Now, with deception, the attacker lands on a system and they have the data problem. They look through the data on the host. How do they differentiate between legitimate information, especially because we've already removed the real goodies, and the deceptive information? And they've got credentials to pick from, they've got connection strings to pick from, and they've got to get both of those right every single time to not be detected. And that's what gives us the advantage.
Oh yeah, and so I'll give you an example. One of the things, so as I told you before, I'm actually in the process of authoring a class for SANS on cyber deception that should be released later this year. One of the things that I'm going to be doing in that class, it's not really in the course material, but I think it'll be a lot of fun, is if you're familiar with those Jelly Belly jelly beans, the ones that taste like buttered popcorn and all that kind of stuff, right? And they are super tasty. But that same company has terrible versions of jelly beans that look exactly the same, right? So it's buttered popcorn or it's earwax or whatever, right? And they look identical, and there's no way to tell the difference until you bite into it. So on day one of the class, I'm putting out a big bucket of Jelly Belly jelly beans, and they're all going to be the tasty flavors. But on day two, I'm going to mix in the nasty ones. And I'm going to tell the students that I did it. Effectively, I'm advertising my deception. Now, in doing so, I might just stop people from taking my jelly beans. Or if I don't stop them, they're going to have to be really, really careful about which ones they do. And if we take that same concept and apply it in the cyber world, I mean, if the attacker does discover that deception is being used against them, one option they have is to leave. Right? Sorry, this is too hard of a target. I don't want to mess with this. I'm out of here. The other thing they can do is just keep on doing what they were doing, in which case we still have the advantage. And lastly, they could drop off, change their IP address, and change their tactics. But now they're going to have to baby step through the network, and it's going to slow them down. So even if it takes us a little bit longer to detect them, they will not have been able to do as much. And that is a huge, huge game changer, because even when we lose, quote unquote lose, because the attacker discovers the deception, we still win. And that's amazing.
Yeah. And really, again, the issue for the attacker, and I don't feel sorry for those guys at all, is that, as you've said, when they discover that deception is in use in the environment, we know for a fact that their cadence slows down dramatically. And the reason we know that is because, Illusive is a raft of nation state attackers, on staff. That's what our founders did before they created the company, right? They did this for their government, So from their own experience, we know that attackers are going to slow down. The second thing that we know is that they're going to eliminate the use of automation. Mm-hmm. And the reason is all the automated tools, make assumptions about what's available or not. Now they will apply some automated tools to do like honeypot buster and other systems to try and identify, honeypots and deceptive objects in the environment. And the high-end companies like Illusive have capabilities in place to mitigate for that, right? Mm-hmm. But this combination of slowing down their cadence and eliminating almost all of their automation is, again, a huge game changer. And in particular, where we use automation to continue to manipulate the story. On a daily basis, the story is being modified. So, if an attacker is on one system and they leverage some deceptive objects and we detect them and kick them out of the environment, they go into their notes and say, okay, this object is deceptive, these interactions, I won't interact with that again. Then they get back into the environment on another beachhead and they go looking through it, and those objects don't exist in that environment. Mm-hmm. It's a different piece of the story. And this is how okay, what you learned is you're not learning. What you learned is you're not getting better at this, and you're not making headway. And at some point, it just makes it so painful that we know that they tend to, in a lot of cases, just move on down the road.
Oh, yeah. And you talk about not feeling bad for the attackers. I mean, one of the quotes that I absolutely love, there is an author who is he's noted author for cyber or for deception, a guy named Barton Whaley. Barton Whaley has unfortunately passed on, but he's written a lot of books on deception with a focus on military deception, obviously. And he said in his book, Practice to Deceive, he said, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have the quote perfectly, but he basically said, in warfare, deception can strengthen the weaker side. When all other things are equal, the more deceptive player or team will typically win. If you think about how attackers have behaved, they use deception all the time, right? They evade our antivirus, evade our IDS, bypass our firewalls. They do all this stuff via deception. I mean, phishing is deception. There's all kinds of deception that they use, and that's part of the reason why they win, because they use it and we don't. One of the things that I think is super, super important, and it's also like, once you get deception deployed, it actually changes the way that you deal with incidents. I know a lot of organizations that if they detect an attacker, the first thing they do is swat the mosquito, right? Kick them off the network. And that might be the right approach. But if you think about it, once you detect that attacker, you understand what IP address they're coming from, maybe what user agent string their web browser is using, and other factors like that, you have incredibly actionable threat intelligence. Organizations spend ridiculous amounts of money paying for threat intelligence services that never provide that level of granularity. So once the bad guy's on the network, maybe you don't kick them off. Maybe you watch them. Learn as much as you can about their actions, what they're trying to do, because the more we know about our adversary, the better our deception story is going to be. So we don't have to kick them off of our network right away. What we could do is watch them, collect that information, and use it to either, hey, maybe we use it to prosecute the bad guy, maybe we use it to catch the insider, or maybe we just use it to increase our knowledge of attacker behavior so we create better stories. So can you talk a little bit about how deception in your experience changes how people do incident response and things like that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So one of the great tools that deception affords is the opportunity to provide actual misinformation to the attacker. Once I get a sense of where this attacker is going, if I have a deceptive capability, I'm in a position to feed them what they're looking for. Oh, you're interested in PII information. We did a campaign years ago with a credit card company, and their struggle was they were aware of a penetration attempt into their environment that was fairly consistent, and it looked as if this attacker was going for credit card data and account data. Mm-hmm. And so what we did is we placed a honey network in their pathway with some finely tuned vulnerabilities to create access, and we had on those systems data, credit card data, that was deceptive in nature, not real customer data, of course, but the goal was to get this information stolen and then monitor for the use of those because we knew that this would be turned into actual credit cards that would be sold in the environment, and then we would go after the attacker's customers. So that when the fake credit cards were sold and issued and then used, those people were prosecuted. And now that vendor of stolen credit card data was out of business because no one, even when he did get information in the future, no one would buy from it.
See, I love that. That is, to date, it's the first time I heard that story. That's my favorite story about deception so far to date. And the reason why I say that is because if you look at that, so let's take a look at spam. Right? If we look at spam, not too long ago, a year or two ago, I read Brian Krebs' book, Spam Nation. Really good book. And that particular book talked about basically former Soviet bloc organized cybercrime and how they use spam to generate money, selling fake pharmaceuticals and all that kind of stuff. And the book goes into a lot of detail, but what you learn from that book is we did not stop that problem because of technological means. We didn't develop some magic anti-spam filter that actually works. What we did was actually the credit card companies, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, they have rules that say you're not allowed to use our credit cards for illegal activity. So as the merchant banks that were supporting the purchases of the fake pharmaceuticals started getting nailed by the credit card companies and threatened with, you can't be a merchant bank for credit cards anymore, those banks went, nope, it was fun while it lasted, but we're not doing this business anymore. Now, I guess, and so the concept was we dried up the money. And that story that you tell, you're basically drying up the money source, which is so, so awesome. Because let's face it, most cyber criminals are just criminals, right? This isn't new. We're just using new techniques. And I think that is, I love that story. That's so fantastic.
Yeah, it's not a known story. It's just one of those. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, it was a very successful campaign. I would, one of the things about operationalizing deception, right, and getting value out of it, I say to people all the time, who's the billion-dollar deception company out there that everybody either uses them or uses a knockoff of them, and it's just widely used across all security companies and people, security teams and organizations, and people look at me like, I don't think there is one of those. And I say, yeah, sure there is, FireEye, right? Yeah. Auto sandboxing. Somebody realized one could apply a deceptive environment with an automated process to a particular pain point and create a ton of pain for bad guys, and create an automated infrastructure for security teams, and it's wildly successful.
Oh yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Because look, when deception is applied intelligently with good automation, and it's got to be automated, it's just got to be automated to be effective. It's a real game changer across the economics and the attack cadence and the whole gamut of what's going on in security.
So let's look at this from the opposite perspective, right? So somebody's listening here and they're going, wow, this deception stuff sounds interesting. I don't know what to expect. What are the biggest obstacles that you see involved in implementing or getting approval for? Or if I'm sitting here listening to this going, I want to do cyber deception, what am I going to be fighting?
Well, you're going to fight a lot, Kevin, right? First of all, there's this, for 20 years now, cyber deception has been a tool that is a tool of last deployment. There's this belief that I got to get all my best practices and my basic systems in place, right? So, latest generations of firewalls and endpoint capabilities and SIM platforms, and there's this general perception that deception is something that you do last when you have everything else nailed. And of course, you never do have everything else nailed. And so one of the things that we have to help people come to understand is if they look at MITRE ATT&CK, right? If they look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which is really a subset of the Lockheed Martin kill chain of what happens after the breach, right?
Yep.
And you look at phase 6 through 9 within MITRE ATT&CK, which is really kind of that broader lateral movement phase of the systems. And we say to people, okay, what do you have to address issues in that space, right? And it's like, I got some behavioral analytics that is blowing up in my face now that there is no new normal.
Yep.
But it's not that much. And we say, okay, good news. A deception campaign, a deception capability fills a gap for you. So it makes sense that you're going for generation 12 of your firewall. It makes sure that you're on generation 3 of your SIM platform and you're on generation 8 of your endpoint tools. But perhaps we should get to generation 1 of a capability for anti-lateral movement, and this is a good time to get a stake in the ground and close that gap. So that's going to be a point of resistance is thinking of deception as a thing you do last. when it's time to get it on board.
And the amazing thing to me about deception, so first of all, deception, I mean, different vendor products do things differently, obviously, but the fact of the matter is most deception technologies that I've seen play absolutely perfectly and even directly integrate with a lot of the legacy security technologies we have. So it's not like it's a rip and replace. It's not like you have to do something different in your environment to go deploy it. But the other thing is it doesn't need any of those things. You don't need a firewall for Pete's sake to deploy deception. I wouldn't recommend not having a firewall, but you can take an organization that literally has an IT staff of 0, and they can deploy deception and it be effective. You can have an organization that has an IT staff of 1,000 people and deploy deception, and the ease of doing so just sort of scales relative to the size of the organization, right? It's not like
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We've got customers with 200 endpoints.
Oh yeah.
We've got customers with 200,000 endpoints on a single system and lots of systems. So one of the things that customers will face, because it's a great point, is budget. You know, okay, so good news, I'm not going to rip and replace anything, but bad news is I don't have a budget line item for deception or for an anti-lateral movement capability, right? Mm-hmm. And so let's be honest, that's going to be part of the process in engaging the senior management, the business management, the board, and all that is to help them understand that this capability is now a mainstream security capability. Yes, it may be a new budget line item, and that's going to be a part of the process is to kind of make that gap, make that opening into the, expand the process. And I get it, security teams have been asking for more and more and more over the years. Mm-hmm. But that'll be one of the headwinds that they'll have to deal with is, gosh, I don't have a deception budget today. So that'll be something we'll have to help them with, make a business case for it, which we can do. We can absolutely do now.
Yeah, I always talk to people and I say, I'll have people like, I give talks on this at like SANS conferences and things like that. And they'll say, look, my boss isn't going to go for this. Is there anything that I can do right now? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Put up a Netcat listener on port 80 on your laptop. If anybody connects up to that, it's actionable. It can be, and that was actually the technical segment that I did last week, was showing different ways you can use something as simple as that. That's not the enterprise answer. That's not the final solution. But imagine you're the security professional who catches the bad guy the day they compromise the network because you set up a Netcat listener, right? And then you take that to the boss and go, look at what this does. We need something that's more scalable, more manageable.
We have this exact experience all the time. People will come up with, homegrown deception capabilities, right? They've done some stuff with Active Directory credentials. Mm-hmm. They've got some listeners in the environment. Maybe they put some files out there, some deceptive files out there and some shares and whatnot. So they've done some homegrown and they've gotten some results out of it. They've seen some goodness. Now they say, okay, deception works. Let's do it everywhere. And now it's like, whoa. This homegrown stuff, that's not going to scale. And I don't want to hire bazillions of people. And that's when we begin a conversation. How do we have an enterprise capability? One of the things that we do for people that's so interesting is do these risk assessments where we just pull their environment one time and look at the credential and connection data that's laying around for attackers to exploit. And say, hey, here you go. If I was a bad guy, I'd start using this stuff in your environment. And that sometimes can be a way in saying, hey, we should talk about really arming the security team to have a very specific conversation with senior management, the architects, and the CISOs about how deception and anti-lateral movement can solve a very specific problem that organization is having.
And I think the good news is today, and this wasn't really the case maybe a year or two ago, but today we've got Gartner talking about deception. We've got NIST incorporating deception as part of their framework. So, you've got some of that kind of stuff that's making it more broadly acceptable. And we also have research studies that actually prove the reduction in time to detect and respond. And I forget what the number was, but it was something like 90 something percent, 93% reduction in response time, so we're now starting to have real metrics that we can go out to and talk to our bosses and those types of things, which I think is really huge.
Yeah, and the time has come. I think the NIST standard being updated is certainly important, and I think people, what I'm seeing a shift in the last 10 years, but more specifically, really in the last 2 years, is a real shift beyond just the most secure security organizations. We've been dealing with the high end, the financial services and the three-letter agencies and the technology and whatnot. We've been dealing with those guys forever in the deception space, but now we're seeing this mass movement of just your manufacturing and healthcare, communications and pharmaceuticals and all kinds of organizations, sports teams and whatnot, coming on board with this capability because it really is becoming a more mainstream capability, and the reduction in workload, that the like measurable shift in this is how long it took us to detect before we had a deception capability, and this is how long it took us to respond versus after a deception capability is very compelling to security teams that are, they've been drowning in alert fatigue for years.
Yeah, I think the Ponemon Institute, the 2019 cost of a data breach study, where they looked at breaches that took less than 200 days to detect and respond to versus more than 200 days, and the average cost was $1 million more. So again, that's a substantial thing.
And look, 200 days is not impressive, right? I mean, getting a detection in 200 days is not awesome. You'd like to do better.
Yeah. Oh, it's absolutely. And the other thing that I find fascinating about deception is, in all honesty, the cost of it. I haven't talked to every vendor that's out there, but the ones that I've talked to, there's nothing close to sticker shock that I've run into. Like, you go look at trying to deploy a network-based IDS that can handle, a steady throughput of 2 gig per second, and it peaks up to maybe 4 gig per second. You're spending stupid money. A SIM that's going to fit into an environment, you're not only spending gigantic money to buy the technology, gigantic money to tune it and tweak it, but also the money to manage it and operate it. Whereas every time that I've seen pricing for deception, I was like, that's it? That's how much it costs? And I'm not saying it's nothing, right? It's not like a $12 thing, but in the context of what it brings, I am unaware of anything with the level that brings the level of impact that deception has for the price points that we're talking about. I mean, it's pennies to go get something that will literally, and I believe this truly, this is about to change the industry that we live in. I always say, I believe that if we get to a point where deception is the standard, it will almost immediately become easier to physically break into a location than it will be to attack them and not get caught across the network. That's crazy.
Yeah, and we see this constantly, is that a lot of our larger customers, the very mature security organizations, leverage third-party red teams to do hardcore penetration exercises in their environments on a regular basis, right? Some of the financials will do this 3 times a year, leveraging 3 different external companies every time to really understand what happens. And prior to us, those exercises tend to be very effective. I mean, our numbers, somewhere between 80 to 90% of the effort is to get the beachhead. Mm-hmm. Once that red team has the beachhead, 10 to maybe 20% of the effort is to get to the crown jewels, and that's a day or 2 at the most, and they own the environment. It's consistent. It's consistent.
Yeah, and if you think about it, I mean, you have tools in Active Directory environments like Bloodhound, which can effectively automate developing the path to get from domain user to domain admin with pretty pictures to go along with it.
Oh yeah, it's fun and easy, you know?
Mhm.
So when we're in the environment, the shift is dramatic. Instantly, the red teams are very frustrated. I've had them call me up after exercises and say, you know, you guys are dirty, filthy, stinking schemers, man. This is wicked what you guys do, right? And what's happening in the shift is that even local red teams, even red teams that are the home team, it's their turf, it's their advantage. We come into those environments and deploy on 6, 8, 10,000 systems and turn those guys loose, and we catch them very consistently. First hop, second hop at the most. It's a lot of fun, and as you say, it's a dramatic game changer, as demonstrated by those kind of exercises.
Yeah, it's stunning. I know we're getting kind of close to the wrapping it up, and I like to try to keep these at about an hour so I don't bore everybody. So let me just throw this to you to kind of wrap things up a little bit. So what would you say, what final thoughts do you have? What would you tell people to go out and do right now? I mean, obviously go buy Illusive Solutions, but what would you tell people to go do like today if they want to learn more about deception, or if they just want to start getting involved in this?
Yeah, great point. So the first thing I would point people to is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. The MITRE ATT&CK framework is an outstanding tool to help security teams and security architects and incident responders take a look at their capabilities as an organization and map them directly to MITRE ATT&CK. And then in particular, focus on phase 6 through 9 and say, what capabilities do we have in this space? And what they typically find is that most of that is going to be some form of behavioral analytics, whether it's network threat or whether it's SIM-based, correlation-based, and then just ask how effective are those tools being? How confident are you in your ability to do this kind of differentiation, and have that discussion as a team, looking at that framework and saying where are we at in this capability? And I think that. That's an eye-opening experience for organizations where the security team is able to say, you know what, this is a gap. This is a gap. And if you can shift the conversation from deception and anti-lateral movement from a nice to have only for the most mature security organizations to a solution that fills a very important gap in your capability, that's when the process really changes for most security teams. And until that has happened, honestly, I don't see organizations being in a position to make that movement as long as they're stuck in that old thinking of, hey, it's honeypots and nice to have. You're not going to get budget or traction on this kind of an initiative until you're real clear on the pain that you're solving. I keep telling people, in our space, in our company, I say, remember people, we are not selling vitamin pills. We are selling pain pills. We're solving a problem. Let's be clear about the problem we're solving, because that helps our customers get budget and get traction for our initiatives.
Yeah, and for those people who don't know, the MITRE ATT&CK matrix is ATT&CK. It is a project where what they've done is they've mapped out what the attackers do from the perspective of their initial involvement with the environment, how they gain access, how they elevate privileges, how they maintain access, how they move laterally, how they exfiltrate data. And for each of those categories, they have different techniques. There's a big giant list of all these different techniques. And the advantage of it is most defenders don't have the luxury of being attackers at the same time. And so defenders don't always know what the bad guys do. And so, yeah, you can go get classes on pen testing, or, get your certified ethical hacker certification or whatever. I mean, there are avenues that you can learn that stuff, but who's got the time, right? What I can do is take the knowledge that other experts have put together, and they've just given me a layout. And they've actually recently expanded MITRE's attack matrix to have like the techniques and then a whole bunch of nested sub techniques and all that kind of stuff. So it provides a really good opportunity, again, going back to that Sun Tzu quote, know your enemy. And I think that is an absolutely phenomenal place to start. And the other thing that I would add in there from my own perspective is just start talking about deception. When you bring up deception to your boss or your boss's boss or your boss's boss's boss the first time, you're a crazy person coming in from the wilderness talking about crazy things. When you bring it up again, it's slightly more normalized. If you just keep talking about it on a regular basis, politely providing justification, eventually your boss comes back to you and says, yeah, why aren't we doing this already? Where have you been? Yeah, you've been preaching that gospel for a year now, but the more you bring it up, the more normalized it becomes. The more normalized it becomes, the more expected it becomes. And that is a huge thing. So just start talking about it with your boss. That kind of stuff is one of the things that I would say.
Great advice, Kevin. Also, if they reach out to Illusive Networks, Wade at Illusive Networks, we can get you a document that maps the deceptive capabilities against MITRE attack, very specifically, but the sub-functions. So that can be a useful tool. But yeah, start talking about it. Absolutely.
Awesome. So I was going to do a technical segment, but I figured we kind of had a great conversation here. So rather than making this even longer than it already is, we'll go ahead and put a little bit of a pin on it for now. Wade, thank you so much. This has been an awesome conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Hope to have you back at some point in time in the future.
Would love to come back, Kevin.
And if you want to come back and even do some demos of technology and all that kind of stuff, more than welcome to do that. Just, let me know. I'm trying to get as many of these things stacked up as possible, get as many folks involved in this as possible, because I really like this stuff. And as I said before, I truly believe that this is the technology that changes our industry forever. This is what's going to, for the first time in the history of cyber, give us an advantage over the attackers. That's never happened before. And I will put it out there that this is the thing that changes the game. So it's been super awesome to talk to you. So thank you so much for jumping on with us.
Thanks, Kevin. I look forward to coming back. We'll do it again.
Oh, absolutely. So as we go ahead and wrap things up, for all of those who are listening, thank you so much for joining us. I try to put one of these things out every week, so thank you so much. Take a look at on a weekly basis. If you enjoyed the content, please, please, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you're interested in it, share it with your friends, because it would really help me get the message out there. That said, make sure you guys have an absolutely fantastic week. Be safe and join us as we take back the advantage.